everyone. Good morning. It's so good to see you in person. Thanks for joining us. Our next guest is the president and CEO of Voto Latino, a nonprofit group that works to educate, energize, and mobilize Latino voters of all backgrounds to go out to the polls. Please help me in welcoming Maria Teresa Kumar. Hi. Good to see you. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Well, how are you? We have 6 days until the election. Are you freaking out?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. You know, the good thing about the work that we do is that we're in the moment of deployment, and we are looking every single morning at the polls and how close it is. In certain areas, when you look at the Latino vote, it shouldn't be as close as it is, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But you know, in 2020, Voto Latino invested $35 million in voter registration and GOTV. As a default, we became the largest voter registration outfit in the country, not by a little, but sixfold. And so in a place like Arizona, we registered and turned out 32,000 individuals. 19,000 of them were first-time voters. You all know how that state came in. And when we look at Arizona today, by default, you're seeing 50% of young people going out to the polls as of last Thursday compared to 2018. And we're seeing a dip in about 20% of infrequent voters. And so I think my challenge right now, and I think for a lot of folks, is how are we going to get low propensity voters out to the poll? Because that's not who traditional candidates and the party normally reach out to. They normally reach out to people who have a history of voting, especially during a midterm.
And I want to get into that a little bit more, but just taking a big picture look, has any other election that you've seen, has the Latino vote been this heavily scrutinized and fought over by both parties?
It hasn't been this heavily scrutinized. I'm still on the fence. Is anybody really fighting for the Latino vote?
Say more.
Well, I think that it's, like I said, so in 2020, 51% of the folks that voted for Biden in the Latino community were either new voters or low propensity voters, 51%. As of 4 weeks ago, in Nevada and in Arizona, came a study out of NALEO, which is one of our sister organizations, close to 51% of Latino voters had been contacted by anyone. But it's because the parties have to reimagine who they reach. Yeah. And in a place like Arizona, young Latinos are a larger vote share than their older Latino voters. Close to like 37%. So 37% of voters in Arizona are under the age of 29. Since the last election, we've had close to 80,000 young Latinos turn 18, just in Arizona. Biden won that state by 12,000. I was in Arizona last Thursday talking to university students at ASU, and they had voted, but they knew so many people that had sat out on the sidelines because they didn't know what the party had done for them on either way.
Well, what's the most frustrating thing you hear from fellow Democrats, operatives, strategists with respect to how they're understanding the Latino electorate or thinking of strategies to approach them this cycle?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the headlines that we saw since 2020 was that Latinos were defecting to the Republican Party. And so we kind of got on the case and said, is that true? And we did tons of research. And Gallup ended up finding the exact same thing that we found in early March. And it was that Latinos were defecting to the Republican Party, is that they couldn't just tell the difference between the two parties.
Right.
So they had every intention of sitting it out. Well, that's fixable. One of the things we learned, for example, is that and this is a poll 2 weeks ago, 71% of Latinos believe in abortion access in ruby red states. It's the #2 issue in the Latino community. We've been doing this, we're 18 years young. We had never seen abortion access as a #2 issue. That's opportunity to have conversations on what differentiates you, especially in a place like Arizona and Nevada.
Right.
Georgia's, the Latino vote is healthy. It's coming out almost at the record numbers. In Pennsylvania it is. But when you look at where has the media concentrated their narratives, it hasn't been in Nevada, where you have a senator who is a second-time incumbent. It has been all on Georgia and Pennsylvania. And it's how do you actually make sure that those individuals are also being highlighted, in this case, Cortez Masto's and the race there, because the individual running against her is very much a MAGA Republican. Something that we found in the poll that we just did 2 weeks ago was that 60% of Latinos believe that MAGA Republicans are a threat to democracy. Again, numbers that we had never seen before.
And I want to talk about that a little bit more. I'm sure people are like, what do you mean Latino voters say they can't tell the difference between the two parties? Both parties are consistently drawing this contrast. I feel like at this political moment, it is very clear the identities of both parties. I talk to Latino strategists all the time who say that they see in polls that Latino voters want and like priorities and policies that Democrats have acted on, but don't give Democrats credit for it or don't necessarily know that Democrats are the one who have delivered those things.
That's exactly right. And so one of the things that we did learn in the poll that I mentioned in March was that if a Latino had voted for the Republican Party, it wasn't on cultural issues. The number one issue was they can't tell the difference between the two parties, but Donald Trump signed my check. And so that gimmick worked. And for someone who is learning the political process, sometimes folks say, well, that doesn't seem very sophisticated. But it's more of people learning the political process. And I had to remind folks, he didn't sign your check. He signed your check, but it was your money. And they're like, oh, okay, and breaking it down. But one of the things that we are trying to understand more is 60% of Latino voters are under the age of 33. How are we teaching them democracy in spaces where media consumption is increasingly balkanized? You will hear individuals saying, well, we have tons of ads running in Arizona on television. I just told you that the majority of young people and eligible voters in Arizona are literally under the age of 29. They're not watching television.
Right.
They're on digital. We registered 650,000 voters in 8 states by not knocking on one door. It was all a digital strategy. And of those, 83% of them went out and voted as a digital strategy with SMS and radio. And so I think we have to modernize how we reach out to voters in this space, because you know who is trying to perfect that? It's the Republican Party on disinformation. And sadly, it's disinformation that they're peddling that oftentimes gets a lot of the Latino voters actually to stay home rather than to participate in an election system that they may feel like they don't understand.
And so do you think that Republicans have been able to attract more Latino voters over the last few cycles because they're better at mis and disinformation, painting Democrats as socialists who want open borders, or because their policies and the way that they're engaging with Latino voters is actually something that those folks want and resonate with?
Right. So again, Latinos are not monolithic.
Right.
And it's very important that we can park Florida and what's happening in southern Texas is a very different reality than the Latino voters that helped deliver Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and has actually made North Carolina at play. And what I mean by that is that in Florida is the only state where young Latino voters will never eclipse older voters. So older voters are roughly about 40% of that population in Florida. Latino youth voters are 16%. So they'll never eclipse. In contrast, if you see a place like Texas, Latino youth are roughly 27% of the population within the Latino community. They're 52% of the classroom. So all these voter suppression laws that you're hearing coming out of Texas and Arizona, they disproportionately impact young people and young people of color because of the volume of these individuals coming and becoming eligible, if that makes sense. And so folks say, well, what happened in southern Texas? Southern Texas, there was folks basically spreading information saying that Biden was going to abolish ICE, and that he was going to abolish the oil industry. Well, what are the 2 highest paying jobs in the south of the border? I mean, in the border region? ICE, the Custom Patrol, and fracking. Those are the 2. And so there was never a narrative to combat this. And I think now that the administration has receipts of what their actual intention is, there's an opportunity to connect and bring back that southern part of Texas.
In 6 days?
Well, that's I demur on that one.
Right. And I want to talk a little bit more about the MAGA polling that you just mentioned. I'm sure you love seeing all these headlines that say the Republican Party is now the party of diversity, which they believe and say, and they're touting, the rise in conservative Latinas that they've recruited who are now elected members. How do you reconcile that with this polling that you have that is now showing Latinos turning against a certain type of or brand of Republican?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest, again, a lot of folks like to cite the MAGA Republican that won. She's Latina in South Texas. The part of the narrative, though, is that that district was going to be consolidated anyway. And so when you have little resources, you are not going to spend money on a district that you know is going to be consolidated. What we do see, though, is that there's not enough effort in turning out existing voters. As I mentioned, 60% of Latinos are under the age of 60% are under the age of 29. By default, they don't have a voting history. And so one of the things that I really encourage the administration and the DNC is to talk about issues that these young people have clearly said they care about. They care about student loan debt. That forgiveness, the $20,000, up to $20,000, that wipes out the majority of student debt in the Latino community. Most folks don't realize that that debt is what prevents a lot of young voters from actually buying a home. We talk about millennials. Millennials are in their 40s, guys. They're less young every day. But if you're strapped with a student loan from when you were in your early 20s, it prevents you from actually accessing home equity lines and wealth. And so those were the challenges. But the other thing is that Latino youth are also part of what we call the sandwich generation. Because if their family they do not have access to Social Security or Medicare or insulin caps as the Biden administration has passed, that 22-year-old, 24-year-old has to decide, do I continue in school or do I drop out so I can take care of my parents? For the Latino community, Social Security oftentimes is the retirement plan.
I'm just curious as we look ahead, not just to November, but in 2024, you're talking a lot about sort of the multi-generational differences within the Latino electorate, highlighting the ways in which they're not a monolith. There are wide differences by education level, gender differences. Mm-hmm. Folks say that in order to sort of understand the Latino electorate, you need to be able to speak to a multi-ethnic, working class group of folks. I guess, one, do you agree with that? Mm-hmm. And two, some say Dems can do the multi-ethnic part, but not the working class part. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that this is the bias oftentimes when we read a headline or we read a poll and say, well, the working class feels X, Y, Z. And oftentimes when people read the working class, they assume rural or white America. And they don't include the vast majority of Latinos. Right. Latinos became the second largest population in America in 2003. But we didn't age into a voting population until 2018. And so when we start talking about even this idea of why we have modern Jim Crow laws, it is because around 2018, folks realized that there was going to be a voting population that they didn't quite understand. Instead of adapting policy and trying to attract them, they decided to create barriers. Shelby County, which was which was Eric Holder, was the AG at the time. Shelby County is the one that presented the case to gut the voting rights. The most underreported story there was that Shelby County had experienced a 297% increase in the Latino population 3 years earlier, according to the census. 297%. And if you look at all the 22 jurisdictions that followed in those short order 3 months who had put these voting restrictions, they had all experienced at least a 90% increase in the Latino population. These are American-born individuals that happen to be Latino that are all of a sudden in North Carolina, they're in Georgia, they're in Pennsylvania, they're in Wisconsin. And instead, again, being adaptive, I would say either party. One party thought that they would be naturally Democrats, and another party, instead of really courting them around the lens of business and business specifically, because they're very entrepreneurial, they decided instead to create these barriers. And you ask, where do I see, a rise in the Latino community that will become more conservative? I would say it's not the Catholics. The Catholics, I often say, we're Pope Francis Catholics, right? Social justice Catholics. But where we do see this curvature is actually around the rise of the Latino evangelical that are in very rural areas. And that is going to be a different story. And that you're going to see them on the rise, but the Democrats are going to have to figure out how do you actually have conversations to attract them as well.
Right. Well, we have time for one last question, and I want to make sure we get to it because Voto Latino has been involved in legal efforts recently in Arizona because of poll watchers, observers, standing outside of ballot drop boxes, some say acting in intimidating ways. Tell us why you felt compelled to get involved in that and any other states that you're looking to for similar instances.
Right. I mean, every single American right now should be very concerned on what we're seeing in Arizona and other states. In Arizona, if you have not seen it, it's individuals that we are currently suing because they are standing next to ballot boxes in fatigues with face masks and guns and taking pictures of the people dropping off ballot boxes and taking pictures of people's license plates. That's very scary. And it's not by happenstance that they happen to be in disproportionately Native American regions and Latino districts. And it was because we saw a rise of folks' participation. In Arizona, it was close to 115% participation in 2020 compared to 2016. So there's enthusiasm, but if you're hearing stories that people are intimidating or that you could cause harm by approaching, that is why we're suing. And it became so severe that the Department of Justice just intervened yesterday. We have 2 lawsuits right now in front of Arizona. We have 4 lawsuits, in Texas. In Texas right now, if you are a college student, you can't register to vote on college campus because it's a temporary address. And you can't register to vote in your parents' address because you're physically not there. Talk about creating a no man's land. Since 2020, just in the Latino community, there's 250,000 more Latino youth that are eligible to vote in Texas. I don't know about you all, but I registered to vote on my college campus. And so one of the things that we need to figure out is how do we pass, in the lame duck session ideally, is some sort of voting rights law in Congress. Because I think we could all agree, again, regardless of political stripes, is that we should have universal laws for every single person, regardless of zip code, on how they can cast a ballot in federal elections, and ideally in local elections. And I also believe deeply that we have to also modernize our election system. This idea that you have to register to vote seems absurd. It's not a modern democracy issue. Look at New Zealand, look at Australia, where they all have almost perfect systems. And what's really interesting is when everybody has the need to vote through universal voting, the best part of it, the silver lining that I have found, Alexa, is that the political temperatures of the extreme actually go down. Because now politicians have to make sure that they're middle of the road and everybody has a better understanding of policy to win their vote. And I think we could all agree that the temperature is a little too hot. And so this idea that we could actually create systems and modernize our system so that we can get back to the business of the people is something that I think I would welcome, and I think many Americans would welcome.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your smarts. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Maria Teresa. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.